Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. It's good to be back with all of you and back in the conversation on Liminal Phrames. Darren, it has been a little bit slow, I would say, over the last few weeks since we've talked. I will also readily admit that I've been quite busy with work and haven't been able to pay close attention to the topic. I do look at it every day, but in terms of the deep dives that I often like to do, catching up on all the podcasts, going deep in the material, I've been unable to do that just because of the demands of my 9 to 5, as they say. So it seems a little slower to me from my perspective. That being said, there are things that are certainly taking place. And like we've often talked about over the years now, we kind of live in an age where we're spoiled with information to the point that we think nothing's taking place when things, in fact, really are happening. And if we were to rewind several years, it would be a night and day difference in where the conversation is now versus where it was then. And I think it really helps to have that perspective. We aren't good at thinking long term. We aren't good. I think human beings aren't particularly great at taking that macroscopic view. We are focused on the here, the now, the imminent, not the larger arcs in the narrative where things are truly going. So it helps to try to do that, force ourselves into that perspective from time to time, just so that we can get a better gauge on where we actually are. That said, we certainly can acknowledge that there are some setbacks that I think are happening, at least where we thought we might be at this time of the year. If we were to go back to December and kind of look at the things we were talking about then and what the community was talking about then, I would think it's fair to say that the expectations were very high, and the reality is not quite as rosy as what we thought it might be. But all that said, we always like to check in, kind of see how things are going in each other's lives and the day-to-day. I think that's really helpful, just to kind of ground ourselves in and where we are with our energy and our commitments and our feelings. And so, Darren, what is going on with you? What's the latest and greatest in your world?
Well, I'm always appreciative of the things going on in my life. And as you know, each of the things I do kind of fold back into each other in terms of all working together to grow my understanding and grow my experience in this field. Preparing a couple of talks I'm going to be giving in the next couple months, including the Archives of the Impossible Conference, which is this year going to be UFOs in the Impossible. That will be held at Rice University. That's coming up in early April. So preparing for that, looking forward to that, looking forward to seeing people in person. And in terms of, what we're going to talk about today, I was thinking about it in terms of taking the temperature on ufology. And I meant that in a couple of different ways, because on the one hand, sort of testing how hot things are, how heated up things are in terms of disclosure. But again, that just being one way of measuring ufology, because the other way you can think about taking the temperature is in terms of health. When we take the temperature of a kid who's sick, we're trying to figure out how healthy they are. So in this push for disclosure, we sometimes assume that must mean ufology is in a really healthy state. But I think that's an open question that we can explore today, both explore it in terms of events that are happening and what that means for how close we are to capital D disclosure, but also just the health and well-being of the community in general as we get close to that. Are we being aware of other factors as well that are part of well-being and health? So looking forward to getting into not just the items that are in the news, but also overarching philosophical approach as well.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And it's easy to really feel like we're on this hamster wheel, right? That we're not really going anywhere. We're running in place, and it can be quite frustrating. I certainly feel that from time to time, and we talked about that quite a bit in our conversations. But it is helpful, I think, to look and do a check-in, kind of see where things stand with the overall health of the conversation, and what are, I would say, some of the factors that contribute to that health or dis-ease in that conversation. I'd like to kind of explore that a little bit too. So there are some, I would argue, some environmental factors that are at play here that influence sort of the overall mood or tenor of the ufology conversation. And I think it's good to call that out when we see it. I want to start with some of the topical things that have been happening in the space, because I do think touching on these really brings to bear and highlights the thing that we're talking about here. So first, I want to start off with the film, the Dan Farah film, Age of Disclosure, that just came out and was released at South by Southwest. Kind of a screening party there. The reviews, I think, were generally pretty good. There were certainly some articles that didn't quite buy it, interestingly enough. But I've not seen the film yet. It's not had a wider distribution. They're still looking for a distributor, as far as I know, on where that film will be released to the mainstream. And so I'm not able to speak in an educated way to the content of the film, only to what was in the trailer and what I've heard about from the reviews. So I'd be very curious to see the actual film myself and kind of weigh in. But I think it is safe to say, Darren, that it made a splash. And some of these reviews were, you could tell the writers were struggling with what they had witnessed and kind of coming to grips with a lot of this testimony. But it certainly didn't make the huge splash that I thought, that we thought that it would. So, and that remains to be seen. Obviously, if it does get a distributor, it does go to the mainstream through Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever, it could very well have a big impact. But what's been your take on that film and its reception at this point?
Yeah, it's interesting because we've talked about this on previous shows, and the expectation was this was going to be the game changer, right? When you think about not just who's involved, but what might be included in terms of revelatory material in light of who's involved. But almost right away, the early reviews from people within the community was that, this didn't include any revelatory material that hasn't been disclosed before. Therefore, not just claims necessarily, but even in terms of new footage. I don't know about you, but for me, I wasn't really expecting new footage because, of course, we know these things have to go through classification systems and whatnot, declassification systems, and we hadn't heard anything about that, so I wasn't expecting it. So what it really comes down to is you're leaning on the credibility of the people involved and the numbers of them, right? The sheer numbers of them. So in other words, we have the same footage, the same, if you will, grainy black and white footage, some of it that we've seen for years now in ufology. Some of us have seen this like almost ad nauseum. And that being supported by, propped up by people of really high credibility saying that this is real. They have known this. Some people, coming out even saying like Jay Stratton, I have seen non-human craft and non-human beings. One thing that's interesting about that particular part of the movie where he says that, and people have pointed this out that have seen the movie in general, some components felt a bit scripted. I think both what Jay Stratton says as well as what Lou says a couple of times, people felt like those were prepared statements, which maybe some people think that sounds a bit put on, but for me, I can understand why they would want to make sure that we really want to get these points out. So let's make sure we script it ahead of time so we know precisely what we're saying. It's interesting, like you say, hearing from mainstream journalists giving their reviews and all of the usual biases that end up filtering in because of that. So for instance, one guy, and I talked about this on social media, was really pretty impressed by the film. He found it pretty compelling, the case that was being made. He said the one point where they lost him, though, was when there was this claim of this 80-year cover-up that involved collusion between defense contractors and the government. And again, what the point I made was that it wasn't like he'd done a bunch of research to determine that that couldn't possibly have happened. He just assumed it was kind of a gut instinct thing. So we still have that, right? We still have people coming with their worldviews, their assumptions about the way that government works. So it'll be interesting. I think what I come away with realizing is that a couple of things. Number one, I don't think it's going to be quite the game changer some people thought it was going to be, and that maybe it was even propped up to be. And this brings to mind something about our milieu in general, is that there's a lot of hyping that goes on these days. And when you have so many shows, so many movies, so many podcasts competing for eyes of attention, everything is breaking news and big, and this changes everything, and these big grandiose kind of claims. Now, I think that some of that was behind this movie. Some people really did think it would change things. I also think that because this movie has been being prepared for quite a long time, like it's been years in the making, I think some other films have come out since then, like even we think of James Fox's most recent film, The Program, and some of these revelations have already come out in some of these other shows, maybe with slightly less credibility because they don't have quite the same number of official sources sort of claiming these things. But the final point I'll make, and then get your take, is that it was surprising to me that there was no distribution deal in place. It was surprising only because everything else seems so well prepared. I like the way the movie is shot. I mean, I haven't seen it, but I've seen the clips like you have said. I like the way it's shot. I like the way that there's this sense of officialdom in where they shoot it. It's in and around Washington. I like everything about that. I like the fact that they're pulling in scientists, they're pulling in politicians, they're pulling in people that worked in the defense industry. But the fact that there was no distribution deal is surprising, because I think some people are wondering if this might almost be a government propped up kind of endeavor to be part of the disclosure process. I don't think it's that. I think there are some people who've been in government clearly that are involved, like Jay Stratton, Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, on it goes. But really, this is still a private film made by a filmmaker who feels like this is a hot topic that he wants to push. But ultimately, I think this is not going to significantly move the needle. I think, again, we'll tip it forward. And as you and I were talking about before we started recording, it feels like we're always right at the doorstep. And it's almost like you imagine this mathematical equation, right? Where they say you're halfway from here to your destination. And if every day you move halfway closer, how long does it take till you get to the destination? And of course, the answer is you never get there, because you're only ever going half of the distance you need to go. And so that becomes ever more microscopic. And that's kind of how this feels, right? We have this conglomeration of information, tips coming out, tidbits here and there, slowly moving us towards that. But when we're going to reach this moment where transformation really happens, where this is really integrated, is unclear. But what's your take on the film and the impact and the potential impact?
Yeah, I my read on this is that it surprises me the lack of impact that it has, given the context of who's involved in the conversation. So let me unpack that a little bit. If you've got someone like Marco Rubio and you've got someone like James Clapper, you've got some, top heads of state, basically, who are in this film. And it's not like these aren't clips of Rubio on a news show that are spliced into a film. Like, this is Rubio and Clapper appearing in an interview for the film, a film about UFOs. So I feel like that's lost on a lot of people, that they look at it at a very superficial level, and like you said, where's the smoking gun video, or the being I can look at, or the definitive statement of X secret, it's inside this building at this address. We didn't get that information, so I'm really let down, and that means there might not be anything to this. It's the same, tired old narrative from the same voices over and over again. I think that claim is played out. I don't think it's true anymore. I think that if you look at the quality, the caliber of the individuals who have been willing to put their faces in public associated with this topic now, it's as legit as it can get, short of a podium statement by somebody really important, right? And so that's where I'm a little bit frustrated in the community's reaction to it, because I think, or maybe not just the community, the world reaction to this film perhaps, is that I think just contextually, it's really hitting the point home very clearly. So I guess we will have to wait and see. Obviously, when it does get that distribution, it'll be made available somewhere. Whether that will be direct streaming or whatnot, it's hard to say. But it will be made somewhere, and people will watch it. There's definitely a demand for this kind of content. There will be a lot of people watching it and talking about it. I would hope there might even be some follow-on interviews that come from this. Maybe people that are willing to talk about the fact that they were in the film. That would be really helpful. And then, like we've talked about many times, there's this cumulative effect. There's a cumulative effect of people of this kind of caliber willing to step forward and speak publicly about what they know. And that has an impact. It may not seem like it, but there are people who are waiting to talk about what they know, or they're on the fence to talk about what they know. And just seeing someone like a Rubio or a Clapper be willing to put their name down to this film is going to push them forward enough to talk about it as well. And we have seen that. I think if we're honest with ourselves, we have seen that's happened. I mean, let's take a look at Skywatcher. That was made a big splash. earlier in the year, and Jake Barber and his team, alleged, firsthand witnesses to UAP retrieval. They talk about how they were on the fence and that they were convinced by other folks like Mike Herrera, who were willing to talk about what he experienced, and that pushed them and nudged them towards being willing to talk about their involvement. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that does move the needle. It just doesn't move it immediately in the way that I think we would like it to move. So I'm very curious what additional voices come forward, and obviously with Skywatcher specifically, and I want to get your take on them. What are we going to see from their efforts? We had a pretty big splash with a lot of the interviews, long form interviews with Ross and Jesse Michaels, and they've released a first episode about their efforts to try to use psionics to get evidence of UAP and make claims that we'll hopefully get one to land, and we'll have really good evidence of UAP. So these are some really huge claims, and it sounds as if that hasn't necessarily materialized, that they're in the process of still collecting that information. And we've heard that there's a second episode that is basically cut and ready to be shown. We just haven't seen that yet. So the effort continues, and I don't think episode 2 is going to somehow magically, answer everyone's questions. But I do think it again is another example of how a project like Age of Disclosure, how witnesses in Age of Disclosure who've been involved in other public-facing narratives have a downstream impact on things that we're not aware of at the moment, but they do materialize sometimes a year after. I mean, it might take that long for these additional witnesses to come forward. So what is your take on the Skywatcher situation and just that general process that we've been witnessing over the last several years, that accretion process of more and more witnesses being willing to step forward?
Well, on that last note, something related also to the film and related to that process in general. First of all, I would say that what I see happening is quite strategic. I think some of this is accidental and some of it is sort of a consequence of the nature of reality and the nature of our civilization today, which I think is important to consider. But the part that is strategic, I think what's happening is you're sort of seeing building up the ground in such a way to support this 10,000-pound object, which is disclosure of NHI. UAP really is the gateway drug to NHI. And in that sense, there is a sense that because it will be such a consequential moment in human history, you really want to sort of come around it from all angles, make sure that all four supports of this foundation are firmly in place before you drop this object. I think some of that is what's been going on. And so some of it's very purposeful, I think. And we keep seeing this stepping a little bit closer, supporting it from these different angles. But one interesting aspect to do with the second thing there, which I was referencing, which is the state of our civilization, specifically our society in America, there's this sense that trust in government has never been lower. In fact, I had one person reach out to me after I posted about Age of Disclosure, and he said, to be honest with you, for a lot of people, and he meant his circles, of course, saying that official sources are saying this seems less credible to us than if some Joe on the street was saying this kind of thing. So there's some people who, the second they hear that government sources or former government sources are saying this, they are actually more skeptical than if their neighbor or whatever was saying this. And there are still some people that are openly questioning, are people like Lou Elizondo actually supporting some effort by the government, and that maybe his pitch as being this person who's ex-government, who in his own frustration is trying to push this forward, might be part of a more coordinated long-term move by government. I think that's possible, actually, probably quite likely, which isn't to say what he's doing is not genuine, but I think it might be part of a larger thrust where there's elements within government that are pro-disclosure, that are trying to push this. So it becomes interesting because then the question is, will we ever get movement prior to, like a show like Age of Disclosure saying, and now for our finale, we've got an interview with Quan Lo, who's this gray alien from Alpha Centauri, right? Like, would that be what it takes? And even then, of course, we would have, like, you think about the Santilli film, right? The alien autopsy film. You'd have people critiquing it. Some people saying, this to me looks totally real. Somebody else saying that looks fake. Of course, now we've got people are going to say, is that AI generated? And this is something that people don't seem to consider, is that even if we did have crystal clear footage that came out tomorrow of an NHI or of a UAP, like a flying saucer in really high definition quality over Manhattan, how many people would that really be a game changer for? And I think it's a smaller portion of the population than people realize, because we are in a time, an era, where there is no consensus around what is a trustworthy authority. So by definition, we're going to see trifurcation, at least, of how people interpret that. So that's something to say, is that I don't think we will ever get this point where there's this really clean delineation of a pre-disclosure and a post-disclosure moment, because I just don't think our society is structured anymore to be able to receive information like that. Now, in terms of Skywatchers, yeah, that's an interesting one, because this is a fair point that we don't have to wait for government to disclose. We can go get it ourselves, because if it's true that with CE5, with HEIS, with psionics, we have this notion that you can communicate with the beings, you can communicate, even call in the craft, then we could presumably get enough evidence to be convincing to the public. So what Skywatchers are attempting to do is not only show that phenomena show up in the sky when they have intention to draw them in, but then you also literally have this attempt to capture craft and be able to show the public that kind of craft. It's interesting, as I was just referring to earlier on, in this hype mode, where everything in media is hype mode now, they came out, made a big splash, said this was what they were planning to do. They felt confident they were going to be able to do it. Then we had this elongated period afterwards, like you say, episode 2 getting ready to drop. I certainly support their efforts. I think they're well-meaning. I think the one piece, though, and this is something I addressed on the last POC episode, NHI is in charge of this. And I don't just mean in terms of influencing a few people in government and whether or not they'll finally say what they need to say or show the evidence, but even teams like Skywatchers ultimately are working with and interacting with and depending on the cooperation of these NHI. Now, people might say, well, this is a thing that's being led by humans, and we brought this up in our last episode. Well, certainly the NHI are passively seemingly letting this happen, but it's not like they're not aware of it. So I think the degree to which information will come, even through a group like Skywatchers, is being very, very carefully calibrated by NHI to a fine-tuned degree that we as humans don't even understand can happen. I think it's almost like a quantum level kind of understanding and measuring of our readiness for that kind of disclosure. So I sense that the Skywatchers thing will be a key piece. It'll be another incremental piece. It'll be another corner of the foundation that gets filled in, but I don't imagine they themselves will be this one linchpin that pushes us over the finish line. What's your take on the whole thing with Skywatchers?
Yeah, I think I share your opinion there. I do think it's going to be, it'll play an important role. It already has played an important role in the conversation with pushing psionics forward as in the way that it has. And that has surprised some, honestly, who thought that we wouldn't be talking about that kind of component to contact so soon. And of course, there's the perennial debate of that kind of intentional contact in general, the merits of doing that. And we've had some discussion in the community recently about that as well. You know, is C5 or HEIS, is that something that people should be doing? Or is it something that they shouldn't be doing? And they're always this sort of, there's this two-camp model that I think looks at it in a very binary way, like, oh, it's totally fine, all contact is great. Oh, it's actually really bad. We don't know what they're going to do. We can't trust them. They can manipulate us. So, you know, any attempt to contact them is just is bad news bears. Let's don't do that. So, you know, it's interesting that the debate kind of settles along those lines. I think that it's more nuanced than that. I think there are merits to contact. There are certainly disadvantages to contact. And a lot of that hinges on the person who's doing the contacting. You know, how prepared are they for that experience, the breadth of the experience that they may or may not have, that is going to play a role in their interpretation. Who they are going into that experience obviously plays a huge role in their interpretation of it. So I'm not one to say that it's all bad or it's all good. I think that's something that we need to be careful with, just like you'd be careful with anything that has the potential to radically alter your experience of the world. You want to be cautious about that. So, but I think what I would say is that we certainly shouldn't be cavalier about it, right? I think we do need to be intentional about this effort. So I hope that people don't get so excited about psionics and contact and just think, oh yeah, like I'm just going to go outside and like call this down and it's going to be great. And, everything's going to be wonderful. We're going to get this evidence. Like, I think that that's a little bit of a naive and dangerous position to take. I think people need to be a little bit more judicious, thoughtful, careful, intentional. They need to really sit down with thinking through, why do I want this? And what is it that I'm hoping to get out of it? And, where am I at energetically in relation to this experience? If you're not doing that kind of pre-processing work, I think it could be quite detrimental to you. And not a guarantee, obviously, but certainly could be. It has that potential, or maybe a greater potential. But Darren, I know you've got some experience with this, and you've talked about it quite a bit, and on your podcasts. What are the merits of this very directed approach to contact and trying to engage contact with non-human intelligence? Do you think that's a good thing people should be trying? Are there protocols people should follow? What is your general take on that?
Yeah, I would definitely have a nuanced take is familiar to people who listen to Liminal Phrames. I would say, first of all, I would sort of see a trifurcation in our community around how people think about heist or CE5 or intentional contact. There's people who are pro CE5, pro heist, think that most of the NHI that are contacting us are benevolent and are space brothers trying to help us be introduced into a larger galactic community. Those people are pro and they will eagerly run out to try it whenever they can. Often they have had positive experiences, although I do think there's reasons why those experiences were positive, and I'll break that down in a second. It has to do with some of what you talked about there. Then you have a second group who've either had a negative experience with NHI, not usually because of CE5 or heist, but because they were contacted or abducted potentially even by NHI, and that was not a good experience in their view. And so those people are saying, no, you don't want to do this. You don't know what you're messing with. Most of the people, I would say, though, this is a key distinction, who are saying, don't try CE5, you don't know what you're messing with, did not have a negative experience through CE5 or heist. They had maybe what they perceive as a negative experience or an overwhelming experience with NHI when the NHI were the ones making the contact. That's a key distinction. So those people who have had what they perceive as a negative experience would say to others, why would you willingly do that? Why would you openly invite something that might look like what I experienced? And of course, we have to say here as human beings, we are persuaded most by our own experience. It tends to create prejudice in us for good or for ill. And so if you've had a negative experience, partly out of concern for your neighbor, you would want them to think twice about doing that, which I can completely understand. But again, I think it is important to point out that the negative experiences that are reported, very, 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 very few of those are from a CE5 or heist experience. And furthermore, I would say that the cases that I am aware of that ended up being negative to some degree, there were mitigating circumstances that help explain why that was the case. So you have the first two groups, right? You have the ones that are pro CE5, you have the ones who would say, don't do this, and I've had experience, you don't want to mess with this, it's not what you think it is. And then you have a third group of people who say, we just have this collage of good and bad and everything in between experiences. You don't know what you're going to get, so don't spin the dial, basically, right? I would raise questions about that approach to that perspective, because the assumption, which is unspoken, is that we have no control, that we are not a factor in the equation in terms of what ends up being rendered in our experience. And I think that's actually incorrect. And this speaks to the fact that we do need to be cautious. We do need to be thoughtful about what we're doing. And yes, it does really help to have protocols. But as I was talking about in my most recent expanding awareness class, and to some extent in the Frontiers of Experience class as well, We want to be not wooden about our protocols, though, because it's not like just a dead ritual that you can sort of rotely go through and recreate and assume it's always going to produce good results. Like, it's about the energetic configuration you're bringing to the experience. And so sometimes someone could say they meditated, they had a positive intention for a being, but they might have all sorts of residual energy that's hanging on them from earlier encounters in the day or from 2 weeks ago. And that ends up being the key factor in the energy they're actually putting out into the field. So this is why in expanding awareness, I talk so much about the importance of, first of all, increasing our own awareness of our own energetic configuration. And that means beginning with things like when negative things happen to you, how can you not be completely overwhelmed by that experience? How can you learn to see that as a learning experience? How can you see that as a catalyst for growth, even though it came across initially as something that was something you wouldn't want to experience necessarily? So in other words, you want to work to wield energy, work with energy, transmute energy in your everyday life, which we have myriad opportunities to do all the time. Work with some of that, I would suggest. Feel like you do have a good gauge on your own default energy, and you can recognize when it's being weighed down by residue from other people or experiences or even the state of the world, or when you're in a good place, because that ends up being what resonates, right? And I've talked about this notion in my classes of sympathetic resonance. So if you sing a note and someone across the room has the sustain pedal down on a piano, then the piano will actually echo that note that you're singing. And it's similar here, that the resonance we put out harmonically is returned, echoed, mirrored by the conscious cosmos, which includes some of these NHI. So that will happen for good or for ill, depending on what note you're basically singing. But the note you're singing is not just derived from some default protocol you're sort of following half-heartedly. It's by your true energetic configuration. So I would say work with that. Understand if you're a person with a lot of fear, with a lot of self-loathing even, that's something you want to begin to work through, because those are low-density energies that will resonate with other beings, including some parasitic entities that might want to attach to that. So be aware of all those factors before you go into it. I think if you can be aware of all those things, it can be a very positive experience. But even there, you want to be aware of the full group that you're going with, because one person can change the configuration of the energy. Not necessarily making it so something negative shows up, but you might just have less of a contact experience if one person is just not at the same harmonic resonance as the rest of the group. So I see sort of three different approaches, right? Pro, con, and the third group that says, we can't tell what we're going to get, so you're better off being safe than sorry. I think we can be nuanced about it. I think there are things you can learn about it. And in the process, more importantly, understand the nature of energy and us being beings that are configurations of energy. Everything we experience in life that we call good or bad is an energetic configuration that we can work with, we can transmute. I think all of that is part of this ongoing evolution of humankind. So I tend to champion it, even though I recognize there are nuances to it for sure as well.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to see the public statements that Jake Barber and Fred Baker and the gentleman whose name I can't recall, who is one of the psionic assets involved in the program, and their team. Their public statements have been very in line with kind of the things you just talked about, and that reflects to me a good sign that they're going into this with the right kinds of intentions and expectations and energy. You don't see these guys with sort of the traditional stereotypical, kind of special forces. We're gonna do this, and then we're gonna capture this, and it's gonna be a mission that we're gonna like. They're not talking about it in that way, and in fact, they led most of the talk of their experience with how it transformed them personally, and I think that is an indication that this has been a genuine and positive experience for them, and they've done some of that processing work that you would hope they would have done before attempting to do something like this. But obviously, it's very public-facing. It's very ambitious in its goals. A lot of different components at play with Skywatcher, so it remains to be seen. But I am optimistic that they will continue to produce some good some good evidence that we can take a look at and hopefully move that conversation forward. In talking about energy and sort of that expectation component that people can bring to the entire conversation, to the disclosure movement, I think it's good to talk a little bit here about the expectations that individuals had going into the Trump administration, the second Trump administration. So we've certainly seen, leading up to Trump's inauguration, there was a shift in the conversation, thinking, oh, they're very pro disclosure. A lot of people on the Trump team that are willing to talk about this and are willing to, spill all the secrets on day one. We're going to get all this information. People in Congress who are in the pro-Trump camp have been echoing the same kinds of statements that Trump's going to be the most, sort of pro-disclosure president ever and declassify all this information. And the reality of what we've seen thus far has maybe been a little bit lukewarm in that regard, at least when it comes to the UAP topic specifically. We just recently did have the JFK files get released, or at least some of them, not all of them. I've yet to see anything in the JFK files or hear of anything in those files that has made me go, oh, okay, that's why they didn't release this for so many decades. Like, there hasn't been an element in the disclosure thus far that has made me go, oh, that was a secret worth holding on to, that the public didn't already suspect to some degree. So I find that kind of interesting and maybe a little bit telling that not all of the secrets have been revealed thus far about JFK. And then that makes me wonder, to what degree are we going to get transparency on these other issues? We certainly had the Epstein files talked about very heavily, and notice how JFK has kind of eclipsed the Epstein conversation all of a sudden, even though it sounded like Epstein was, imminently releasable, and now nobody's talking about it for interesting reasons we can speculate. But we've got that. We've got MLK. We've obviously got UAP, COVID. All these sorts of things that the partisan supporters of the Trump administration have been saying, we're going to get the truth. We're finally going to get the truth. So, I think it begs the question: are we in fact going to get the truth? Are these expectations realistic? Is this a good behavior for the community to exhibit? That's sort of kind of a flavor of the month. Whoever's championing what the things that I want them to say, I'm just going to be very supportive of, regardless of who they are as a person and their their ethics, their morality, et cetera, et cetera. Is that a healthy sort of thing for us to lend our energy to, or should we be a little bit more discerning when it comes to managing these types of expectations? What way should we approach this possibility space with the Trump administration in revealing what they may or may not know? Obviously, it's still early days, so I admit I am maybe reaching a little bit of a premature verdict on the quality of that transparency, but thus far, there's been a lot of talk, maybe not as much actual evidence that we can take a look at. So what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on the Trump situation? Is it as pro-disclosure as we might think? Where do you see that going?
Well, certainly we've seen people who at first were pretty hyped up that we're going to have a total change in approach and that this was going to be a pro-disclosure kind of administration. I am not surprised that has not happened the way people thought it would happen. I think people need to recognize that this also is a public relations kind of design, in the sense that administration is more concerned that they are seen that way, perceived that way, than they actually deliver something that really changes perception on some of these key matters. Like you say, there's numerous matters. They seem to be competing for attention week to week. And it almost seems like a bunch of people gathering around rumors in the bathroom, in high school, wondering what juicy details are going to leak out. And some people have even pointed out, frustratingly, within ufology, that UFOs and UAPs seem to have been dropped down the list behind Epstein, MLK, JFK, like you say, all these other elements. And it's not being given the seriousness in terms of approach that people would say it should be. We look at the recent JFK hoopla that's been happening over the last couple of weeks. And what's interesting is Not surprisingly, in my mind, you do get some of what people thought was promised. You do get the dump of some documents. And when you do look through the documents that are new, a lot of people think it's suggestive of, for instance, CIA involvement. The fact that the CIA didn't at least step in to prevent Oswald from being anywhere close to where JFK was that day. Some people think that's suggestive that they at least passively allowed this to happen. Other people would say it's much more than that. They knowingly were part of this inside deal to make this happen. And there are many reasons to believe, again, contextually, that that would make sense. The fact that JFK was willing to warm up to the Soviet Union, willing to demilitarize and denuclearize our assets and those kinds of things. And you can understand for the war hawks, this was not something that was palatable to them. So there's plenty of contextual reasons to believe that this was a setup, that it was not just a single shooter acting on their own initiative. But there's nothing that's the smoking gun. There's even more suggestion that more than meets the eye was going on, but there's nothing that definitively says we know this now, everything changes today because of this. And if you think about it, that's kind of what's happened with the UAP matter as well. And I think will continue to happen. And what we're also recognizing is that even when we get into the drones, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later, a lot of people thought, finally, right, we've got an administration that's going to be honest with the American people about the drones. But the first public release about the drones was responded to with laughter, derision, skepticism, almost outrage, because it just seemed more of the same. When this notion came out that this was just FAA research that was being done, people said there's no way that's possible. It didn't seem to fit well with other statements that have been made by other organizations, including the FAA. So what I think we're seeing is that, no, it's not the panacea that people thought it would be. And of course, there's bigger questions around the destabilization of the country, of the planet that's going on right now that some people think should trump, if you will, these other matters. And that in itself is part of the issue here, because the question is, do we have the same inertia, momentum for disclosure in light of the socio-political, geopolitical climate we're in right now? That's an open question, as well as the open question around, should it be a priority in light of what's going on in the country and in the world? And this has to do with what we're going to talk about later in terms of a more philosophical gauging of health and well-being, not just of this movement and the people involved, but of the planet populace in general.
Yeah, I look forward to getting into that specifically. And I think it's telling that you've had so many folks who've been vocally grandstanding on transparency, who now have these positions. And these are the folks who've made big statements, and now they're the top person in their agency. They have positions of power. They can release this information or push for the release of this information. And the fact that it hasn't been an immediate, open kimono, whatever, should tell you a little something, right? It should tell you that it's not as simple as they made it out to be, that it's easy to say, we want transparency, just give us the facts, give the American people the truth. But when you have access to that information and actually see what that information entails, and you're in that kind of a role, you have a responsibility. It's not just a role where you can, post something on social media. You have a responsibility. Your words have weight, have power, have an impact on the world in a pretty dramatic way. And so I think we should anticipate, given the nature of what we believe this disclosure or secret to be and all that it entails, we should anticipate that this isn't going to be a simple, easy thing of just releasing a few files and calling it a day, right? This is a very complicated issue impacting many, many different facets of our government, our society, our entire world. And so I'm a little bit encouraged, to be honest with you, that we haven't seen such a rapid transparency, because that tells me that we haven't lost people who have the capacity to be thoughtful, a little bit thoughtful and responsible, given the power that they now have. They're not just going off half-cocked and doing whatever they thought was right before they got into those roles. So I think that's a good sign, and I'm still curious to see what's going to happen. We've talked about Trump specifically in the past and his own reactions to disclosure questions, which he's received many times, he's fielded many times, and his reactions to those questions are themselves quite telling, in my opinion, given what we know about Trump's character generally. So if you analyze how he responds to other subjects other than UAP disclosure, his body language, his tone, what he's willing to say, not willing to say about UAP is pretty dramatically different than it is for these other topics. And I think that is a tell as well. But you brought up drones, Darren, and the fact that we weren't really given, I think, a straight answer from the administration about what these drones were that we were apparently seeing in December and January before the inauguration, and we were hoping to get some answers on that. There was a recent 60 Minutes piece on the drones that I think tried to delve into this issue more deeply. There clearly was meat on the bone there. There wasn't just, it wasn't as simple as case closed here. It was just the FAA doing research. So what is taking place in your mind with the drone situation? Obviously, it's not just been reported in the United States. It's being reported in other parts of the world as well. What is your take there? Is it solely the FAA or some government agency with these kinds of things? Is it NHI? Is it a mixture of the two? If it is NHI, if it involves them at least in some capacity, what's the game there? What is why is it that they present themselves in this way, or may choose to present themselves in kind of a drone-like fashion? What's going on?
Well, not surprisingly, I think the answer is multifaceted. I think the first thing I'd want to point people to, though, is the fact that we have really short attention spans in today's era. And that has numerous implications or consequences as a result. One is that whenever we hear the drones being talked about, when I tune into one news reporter talking about it, another newscast mentioning it, I keep seeing that elements that we know are in the picture, some are included and some are not. And different ones are included in different newscasts than others. And so what's frustrating is, while you have these newscasts purporting to be trying to solve this once and for all, they often are not bringing to bear all the relevant information we have. So that's challenging. And of course, news these days knows about short attention spans and recognizes we can maybe do a 2 or 5 minute segment, 10-minute tops, and then we have to move on to something else. And so that is going to limit how much nuance you can get into. Just yesterday, I think it was, or day before, Lou Elizondo was on CNN again. But it was sort of a repeat of the usual things, where the newscaster says, "You're saying there's NHI and we actually have recovered bodies? That sounds crazy." And then Lou says, "Well, it might sound crazy, but this is true," and blah, blah, blah. I would prefer to call it biologics. So we have this regurgitation of the same elements over and over again, but we don't have the depth of time and a deep analysis of all the data to get to the right answers. And so what I think is going on with the drones is multifaceted. I think on the one hand, there's this recognition, and this was discussed on 60 Minutes, is the sense that the FAA themselves and these high-ranking officials, including from NORAD, that are charged with defending the North American continent, are saying, we don't really know what these are. They're not ours. We can't pick them up on radar sometimes, and we can't block them either. And these are things you can usually do with conventional drones. So again, they might not be saying it, but they're certainly implying by what didn't work that if nothing else, it's a next generation technology that means our usual techniques to stop them aren't adequate. And that in itself should be headline news, would have been headline news in a previous era, where we're saying we're almost certain they're not ours. They're flying over our most sensitive facilities and airspace with impunity, and we can't stop them. So again, as we've discussed before, even if you just look at the geopolitical situation, that is concerning. And I do think, by the way, this is one piece of what's going on. I do think some of these are likely coming from China. They are really advanced drone technology that may even have been the products of reverse engineering attempts, because we know these craft did not just crash in the US, they've crashed around the world. And that would make sense. And then it becomes a really complicated matter for the US, because when you have not just journalists saying what's going on here, but you have constituents and mayors and governors on the northeast coast of the US saying, what's going on? Don't tell me it's nothing. I see it over my house. Then you have this question of how much can you even acknowledge the situation if it is partly a geopolitical concern? Because if this is China, some of it, right, and I think some of it is, then basically, according to the rule of law, that's an act of war. And what certainly the Trump administration and even previous administrations would not have wanted to admit or take as a position of weakness, but to let an adversary fly over your most sensitive facilities and not acknowledge it, not say, you can't do this, we're going to stop you, says something about our ability and our readiness and our willingness to do what's necessary to stop that. Now, on the one hand, you could realize, of course, when you think about it, there might be very good reasons why some people in the know, I don't necessarily mean in the administration, but the people in the defense industry who recognize what this is, right? The people in the military, NORAD maybe even, who recognize this could be China. It becomes very delicate if you start acknowledging that publicly, because then you might have not only the war hawks, but the people within society who think that's not something you should stomach. We need to go to war with China. Everybody knows World War III is a game changer. It's game over, basically. So you can understand why, even if they suspected it was China or even knew some of it was China, they would be hesitant to acknowledge it. And maybe there's these back channel kind of conversations going on. I'm sure there is. On top of that, I've recently seen some coverage of the fact that when it comes to World War III and the way that that war will be waged, it's very different than previous wars. And we live in a different world technologically. Everything's digital now. Everything's connected. Everything's mostly accessible through Wi-Fi of some sort or another. So, sensitive water supply systems and whatnot have been broken into by the Chinese. And basically they're preparing so that if there ever was some sort of conflict, then they could destabilize the domestic situation for Americans, and that would take away from the initiative the administration might have to fight overseas. And this is already happening. So this posturing towards war, and even this line between when war is actually being waged and when it's only being threatened, is a gray one. And I think we're already into that grayness. So that's the first thing, that I do think some of this is geopolitical in nature. I do think some of it is Chinese, and I do think that is concerning for many different reasons that I just pointed to there. However, we also know, as I've been saying in previous parts of this conversation, NHI are watching. They're always aware of what's happening. And I think some of the objects being spotted, observed, and measured are also NHI vehicles. They're genuine UAP, and UAP being operated by NHI. And we know that they can mimic existing technology. So it's not even that you can look at it and say, oh, it's that shape, it's a black triangle, I know it's NHI. They can make it look like a drone. But they often, either deliberately or by some sort of strange consequence, sometimes it looks a little bit off, right? It's not quite right. The lights are wrong or something. And again, that's suggestive of NHI without being definitive, which again, I think is part of their ongoing way of slowly turning up the temperature in our awareness. So I think that's going on as well. And it's complicated. I think that you have different organizations, different government organizations even, arguing with each other and not being on the same page. I think there's this issue, which I know we'll get into a bit more later, about worldviews, about expectations of what this could be and how that shapes people's response in the midst of a societal discussion and situation that is more complicated and incoherent than ever before in our history. So this does not bode well in terms of a sophisticated analysis of the situation and even kind of robust response. I don't think either of those are on the table in light of the circumstance. And most overarchingly, what I want to say is that as NHI watch that and watch our response, I would ask the audience, do we seem like a species that's ready for open contact when we have this much derision and confusion even amongst our own people? I would say no. So all of that, I think, is in the mix, and it's complicated, and no one answer. And furthermore, and perhaps most importantly, I don't think we have the kind of discussion space anymore that even is robust enough to get to all these nuances.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I hope that we are getting closer to that discussion space being more of a reality. I remember too with the drones, just another data point to add in there that Jake Barber even mentioned that his team was aware that these weren't just FAA drones. So the narrative is that it's just one kind of simple explanation doesn't certainly seem to hold water. But beyond that, I wanted to talk a little bit about one last sort of topical issue that came up very recently this week. And that's that apparently David Grusch has accepted an offer to join as a senior staffer, senior advisor on Eric Burlison's team, and to advise specifically on UFOs and UAP. So that's very encouraging. Burlison, I think, has come along for this journey, and he's come quite a ways from where he was initially in that first hearing with David Grusch. And the fact that he's willing to bring David on as a staffer and guide efforts in getting information is a positive sign. I think the trust that I have in David Grusch is very high. My expectations for his ability to kind of sleuth this out and get people pointed in the right direction are very high. So obviously, time will tell. It remains to be seen the fruits of that hire. But certainly a very exciting development that I think we can get pretty excited about in the community. But your quick takes on that before we then switch to the last part of the conversation to talk about the kind of philosophical aspects of where we are right now.
Yeah, this is certainly interesting. This is one of the more promising elements that's emerged recently. Like we've been saying, there was a lot of movement last year, even the end of last year. There was certainly a lot of hoopla even in January when all the psionics stuff started coming out and these new witnesses and new whistleblowers. Here we are now almost into April. Spring has sprung and it feels like things have stalled a bit. So the David Grusch announcement was one of the more encouraging elements for those who are wanting to see ongoing movement. I just want to read this. I think this quote is from News Nation in regards to what David Grusch is going to be doing. So, quote, David Grusch, a former U.S. intelligence officer and UAP whistleblower, has been hired as a senior advisor to Congressman Eric Burlison, focusing on UFO/UAP issues. The role will not involve direct work with the House Oversight Committee, despite Burlison's membership. The appointment is set for approximately 4 months, coinciding with the end of a federal secrets probe, unquote. So that's the first thing to note, is that he's going to be working specifically for Burlison's office and playing this role of a senior advisor. The fact that he's not directly involved with the HOC, the House Oversight Committee, is interesting. People have wondered out loud why that is. I think this is important, though, because one of the things that we've heard ongoingly is that Congress people don't even know who to ask, and they don't even know what questions to ask. And of course, the gatekeepers who are sitting on the information know how to answer things or even direct people or misdirect people in ways that they will get the runaround or never get to the real goods. Now, David Grusch is an insider. He was tasked with understanding these things, talking to whistleblowers, putting two and two together. So if anyone knows where to look, it's him. So that is encouraging in itself, because he can say to Burlison's staff, this is who you need to talk to. This is the door you need to knock down. This is potentially even in the future who you need to call in front of a committee to testify to this, preferably under oath. So all of that sounds good to me, sounds promising. I still tend to think, though, that I have this sort of sense overall that this is, again, slightly warming things up. It's going to be firm up the foundation a bit more, but it itself will not be the game changer. I think another question that is ongoingly on my mind, I'm curious to get your take on it too, is we heard about the investigation into Grusch's claims, not just about this cover-up, but how he was targeted, illegally and threatened and whatnot. And that's been going on for a long time. And David Grusch for a long time at first came out, made these claims, these allegations, but then kind of exited stage left. partly because he would say, I can't really comment on that because it's an ongoing investigation. As far as I've heard, that has not been resolved yet. And that's interesting in itself. So what's really going on there? What can he say to Burlison's staff that's different than what he could say publicly or in front of a congressional committee that's being, televised, that kind of thing? Certainly interesting. If you're going to call anybody, Lou Elizondo, David Grusch, Jay Stratton, these are the kind of people you'd want to have involved because they know where to look. So it's encouraging, but I don't necessarily think it's going to be the one domino that tips everything over. What's your take on all that?
Well, I think you've pointed out a really important detail there, that Inspector General investigation kind of fizzled out, and I believe Thomas Monheim, who was the ICIG who received that complaint from David Grusch, left the Department of Justice. I can't recall if he was terminated or if he left voluntarily when the Trump administration came around, but that was pretty recent. And so the timing there isn't, in my opinion, coincidental, that you have the conclusion of this ICIG investigation, whether it really concluded, officially or concluded unofficially, not a case closed, just where we just stopped investigating. Regardless, that seems to be done, at least from all that we can tell. I haven't heard news that complaint has been taken back up by the new ICIG, in other words. And David, I think, as most would say, at least from my perspective, appears to be a very disciplined, by-the-book kind of person. So he's not going to participate in anything that would be improper and conflict with an ongoing investigation. So the fact that these sort of dominoes kind of fell when they did, that makes me believe that ICIG aspect is over, that freed up David to be able to be a more active participant in the conversation in Congress in this kind of capacity. And that, of course, leads to a lot of other questions. What can he now say? Where can he point these Congress people to kind of getting more information? What about his clearances? What can he say in a SCIF? What power does he have to call additional testimony and witnesses? Remember, he mentioned both the willing and hostile witnesses. What authority does he have now to help them get those names, under oath or under subpoena? I mean, these are just open questions that remain to be answered, but I think are worth asking. And I think time will tell what the results of this hire really mean. But the fact that it has that 4-month tenure, I would hope means it's going to be pretty fast and intense. I mean, he's not like he's been sitting around doing nothing since his testimony in Congress. I think David is a brilliant person who's collected a ton of information, and he's probably just going to dump as much as he can into his capacity to try to move this forward as quickly as possible.
Yeah, well, I think one point that is worth highlighting here is the 4-month nature of the investigation, because that's not a lot of time. Right? When you think about actually, first of all, him coming forward and giving information, and then people beginning to knock on doors, you presume they're going to be stonewalled, they're going to be misdirected. So to actually get to the places they need to get testimony from the people they need to get it from, and then investigate the claims that are made from those people they've interviewed, that takes a long period of time. And I just don't know that 4 months is long enough. Now, does that mean that maybe they learn things that suggest they should open up a new inquiry? Maybe that's going to happen. We'll see. Now, in terms of the ICIG, the Inspector General, and this ongoing investigation, it becomes interesting because how much can Grusch say if that's done with? If it is done with, why did we not hear any sort of announcement about it? My sense would be that if there was an investigation of the depth required to really get to this, that they would actually also uncover elements of the ongoing secret keeping, the gatekeeping, that it's not just about Grusch. I'm guessing that these rabbit holes would lead elsewhere. and expose the fact that there's been this massive cover-up and an ongoing attempt to quiet people, suppress people, even potentially assassinate people. So I can't imagine they were able to wrap it up. And the fact that we had a change of personnel becomes really interesting. So I think where that goes is fascinating to me, an open question. The other piece that's come up recently is that I think Burlison's office has even talked about giving Grusch new clearances that would allow him perhaps to escape the clauses of some of his previous NDAs. So if that's the case, he might be able to say both privately in a skiff or even perhaps publicly more about what he knows. In other words, if they give him a new clearance, does that grant him something that supersedes his previous agreements? Will be interesting, and we'll see where it goes from here.
Yeah, stay tuned on that for sure. So, okay, well, let's turn our attention in the last few minutes here to kind of the overarching conversation about where we are now and distinguishing, really what disclosure may be from what ufology is, what the different motivations are for different groups when it comes to disclosure, how we bring our worldviews into that conversation, really kind of rating the overall situation at the moment. And I think weighing in that calculus the nature of what disclosure really is versus what our expectations are, and whether we even have adequate alignment between those two things. Because I think you and I have talked a great deal about this, that I think we both agree that the general expectation for disclosure is pretty misaligned with what the maybe more the greater nature of disclosure actually is. And so how do you get to a place where we can kind of merge those two things? We can bring them closer together and reach more of a parity, because right now it almost feels like the expectations they're like ships passing in the night that just don't have any direct correlation to the true nature of what disclosure may mean for humanity.
Yeah, that bigger overarching question about, what is ultimately the nature of disclosure, what is needed to be disclosed, that's massive and multifaceted. And I think almost every different group that you imagine wanting information, they each are prepared for certain kinds of information and totally unprepared for other kinds of information. And that's part of the problem, is that misalignment, that people have an expectation of the range, right? The nature of the information, what it would be like, what range it would fall within. And so even in the age of disclosure, you have that one politician saying at the beginning, the American people are ready for the truth. How do we know whether or not the American people or the world populace is ready for the truth if we don't know the nature of the revelations? And I could certainly think hypothetically in a sci-fi kind of way of some notions that people would not be ready for. I'm not saying those are the things, but I'm saying that to say that without knowing the parameters is kind of a stretch at the least. The other thing that occurs to me is that even though we have what we call a community, a ufological community, even the smaller group we used to call UFO Twitter, even those people are represented in different groups, different subgroups, right? And often they're not aware that there are different groups because people tend to end up in echo chambers, just like with society, talking to the people who already agree with them. And, then you think about what people are expecting disclosure will bring. So there's some people who are experiencers, for instance, who are looking for vindication. They're looking for confirmation and vindication that their experiences were real. Now, they know it was real, right? They don't doubt that, but they want people to look them in the eye, even sometimes family and friends who doubted them, but certainly officials and officialdom, to say, you're right, we're sorry, we misunderstood the nature of reality, this is real. So there's some people looking for that. And I think the one challenge with that is that aspect of disclosure, the part that they experienced, is part of it, but it's only one part of a much larger whole. And I don't think you can deliver just that part without exposing some of the rest, hence part of the challenge here. There are other people in ufology who are just looking for some cool tech. This is kind of a sci-fi thing, right? Almost like a Star Trek adventure. And of course, they have certain assumptions about what the nature of it is, being ETH and that kind of thing. You have other people who are much more socially involved, in the sense that they want to see an end of the power elites in the world. They want to see an end of the unequal distribution of power and wealth and resources in the world. And they imagine some overarching force coming in and making that happen. In other words, it's not just about revelations, it's about a shuffling of the deck that would happen because you would have a force that's more powerful than the elites that are currently in place. Then you have another contingent who recognizes this represents a consciousness awakening. One of the things I've talked about is that, to my surprise, because I was doing consciousness work and whatnot well before I got into ufology, and to my surprise, in this era, the last 10 years or so, ufology has been one of the main mechanisms for consciousness awakening. Because, as you and I both know, you get in with nuts and bolts maybe, but then you quickly understand about this consciousness connection, the fact that it's not just them that are different than we thought, but we are different than we thought. We understand this primacy of consciousness, the whole move towards idealism that we've been exploring in this podcast. There's also that piece. So some people picture disclosure meaning that, a consciousness awakening. And you even get some people that so much want to change in a shuffling of the deck that they imagine this moment when NHI comes in will so change not just the world, but the nature of reality, almost like the tearing of a veil between these supernatural realms and the natural realm, that it's almost like ushering in an apocalypse of sorts. So you have all of those in play, or some blend of them, and some others probably as well. So that's where I would start, is that there are different groups, sometimes not aware of each other. People keep talking to their own echo chamber, and that reinforces this notion that they have a sense of what this really entails. And then you have people all wanting this gold at the end of the rainbow, but how they would actually define that if you really press them on what do you think disclosure means in terms of its consequence for humankind, and you get very different answers. So I find that fascinating, and I find it fascinating that people aren't even aware that those differences exist.
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of be on the front lines of that conversation and be an active participant in that conversation for the last few years. I've certainly witnessed a lot of change in the public discussion about what disclosure might be over the course of my time, talking about this. I think if anyone's followed, my own journey, of course, it's definitely shifted into the consciousness aspect of it, and consciousness has gotten quite a lot of lip service in, I think, the podcast community. Not just the small podcasts, but even some of the larger ones have started talking about that now, and that it could be, a part of what this all really is. But you and I obviously would hope for more traction than just sort of a wink and a nod to a speculation, and I think we're waiting to see that take hold. In part, what I think will be the catalyst for that change is going to be sort of the dawning of this new era of humanity that we're kind of in the midst of right now. We touched on this in our last episode. That is this, sort of the weirdness era that we're moving into, where our technology is really radically going to change our understanding of what it means to be human and connected in the world, in the universe. It's revealing aspects of our reality that I think are trickling down to the average person now. The day-to-day conversation is starting to slowly acknowledge that our science has even come to the limits of what it can know under the traditional paradigm. And as these technologies advance and AI becomes more sophisticated, I think it's going to make that even more apparent. And of course, I've shared with you recently, there was... I can't recall if it was ChatGPT or Grok that was talking about the nature of, I think it was ChatGPT that Sam Altman had shared this, that is talking about the nature of reality itself. And ChatGPT's response, synthesized this information and said that, consciousness is the bedrock of reality. And so again, these are things that are permeating our culture very slowly, but that are accumulating, pretty quick pace in I think in the near term. And once we have that shift in vocabulary and experience, and more people have an experience of that, then they have an ability to better align with what this all might be. So I'm excited for that transition to take place. And I also would say, and I did touch on this a little bit with the podcast, my own experience with podcasting, but if you step back and look at the trajectory of this conversation from 2017, how that catalyzed so many podcasts and documentaries and very animated discussions about this subject. I view that as kind of this laboratory environment that allowed for a number of hypotheses to be vigorously discussed and debated and tested and tested in a public forum, but not in a broad public forum. So you've got a community of interest here. I'm talking about the ufology, the community of ufology that's hyper fixated on this material, and they're going to go through everything possible right away and go through all the theories, discuss them ad nauseum, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How many hundreds of podcasts did Lou Elizondo do? As part of this initiative, and what you saw coming out of that initiative, those few years of incubation, I would argue, is where we are right now. All of that work, that discussion in the community of interest has percolated up into the broader, starting to percolate up into the broader conversations. And how do I know that that's the case? Because we're seeing it in legislation, we're seeing it in Congress, we're seeing it in just the water cooler conversations. More people are willing to talk about this than they've ever been willing to talk about it before. But I want to remind folks who are listening to our show, because if you've been this interested in the subject for so many years, you're going to be disappointed in where the conversation's going next, because you have to almost think of it as like the broader conversation is starting back at square one from where we started talking about, and the community have been talking about this many, many years ago. And look, I want to absolutely acknowledge that I'm a latecomer to this conversation. So there have been many, many, many folks long before me and you and other podcasters who've been devoted, tons of blood, sweat, and tears to this subject and hypothesis testing through books and everything. But through the beauty of technology and the mediums that we have now, we've been able to kind of accelerate, we're going to benefit from the work that they did before and accelerate that conversation, almost like a pressure cooker environment, and then push that forward. So this is, in my opinion, the trajectory of how this entire movement is going, but it has these sort of recursive cycles, and I think you could get quite frustrated with where we are right now and thinking, oh, we're really not making progress. I thought we've already known X, Y, Z. Well, the sphere, the circle of people who know X, Y, Z is getting larger, but we still have a lot of territory to cover. So I think people need to get a little bit more patient as we move this forward and be willing to engage folks who are new to the conversation and willing to bring your own experience and expertise to that conversation so that you can help them get more up to speed on where this might be headed. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, very well said. And I would say that even though I said earlier that it was kind of frustrating to, on the one hand, read that one journalist say there's no way that there could have been an 80-year cover-up and that this many people could have kept the secret, and they were acting basically on a hunch. On the other hand, I can completely understand that perspective. And at one point, I held that perspective, right? So to the point you're making, we have to allow them the same luxury that we've had, which is taking years sometimes to really grok this material and understand the implications. And that is a process that involves some ontological shock, and therefore it can't happen overnight. As much as we learned this over years, and it came in deeper and deeper and more granular levels of understanding, we can't say, look, we've synergized this all into this one MP3, just listen to this and you'll be up to speed, right? It doesn't work that way, because you have to incrementally and in step-by-step kind of process, understand these things, let them be integrated into your being and your sense of what the world is, what reality is. And only when that's become integrated can you then go to the next level. So that just takes some time. So I think one thing I would say to our audience is that we're going to have to be prepared to allow people to go through some of the process of integration and expansion that we've been through. The other thing I would say is that I think it's important that we consider the spirit by which we seek disclosure. And this is something I would say in general, and I teach in my classes and in my coaching, because sometimes we can focus on an end goal and kind of, without saying it, sort of think that ends justify the means. And in that sense, we will sometimes call out the gatekeepers. We will post pictures of the gatekeepers. We'll almost want to shame them into just getting this out. But as you kind of hinted at earlier, and we've certainly navigated some of this over the course of our podcast, some of that gatekeeping involves people who are well-meaning and who are aware of how much this would be destabilizing to society and how much is just not able to be fully understood yet. And to keep it secret so that it can be studied more and only carefully let out when there's enough understanding to explain what it is, number one, and for it to be integrated healthily into society. That is wise governing. So I don't want to make this sound like it's all a one-sided affair and we just need to get these bad people that are part of the empire and we're the freedom fighters that are part of the rebellion trying to get us out of them. I think it's more complicated than that, as we've been saying. So we want to be aware of the spirit by which we are pursuing disclosure, and imagine that this larger cosmic community is watching us, watching our response. And as I said on the most recent POC episode, not just watching our actions, but they know our intentions. They know the way we're thinking about these other people, right? That are, at the end of the day, our brothers and sisters, even if they are, misguided in some way. I also want to say that it's important to realize that what you mentioned, that we as a society are slowly but surely shifting our understanding of reality, to me, that's all synchronistically connected. So we might have the government who comes along and says, maybe we know something's coming towards the end of the 2020s, right? And so from 2017 on, as some people have suggested, we're changing our posture. We're going to begin to slowly let this out, right? And it begins with Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal's article, but it rolls out from there. And like you pointed out, when we look at decades of history compared to what the last, 5, 6, 7 years have looked like, it's night and day. We've seen miraculous movement, basically. But in that same time, we are seeing a notion like idealism, or if not idealism, then dual aspect monism as a philosophical model to understand reality. Those have been gaining steam quickly. We're seeing movements in neuroscience, in astronomy, in physics that are all supporting this notion of this consciousness as primary kind of model of reality. And that also is setting the foundation for disclosure. And I don't think it's coincidental, of course. If you look at it honestly, I think objectively, you would say, what are the chances that we would see this movement in society amongst our academic gatekeepers in terms of defining the nature of reality, that would be happening right at the same time as we're seeing this growing movement towards disclosure of beings, of intelligences who have been saying in the lore all along that that's the nature of reality. I think that's all synergistically connected, and to me points towards something that has become very clear to me over time, that everything, this reality, is to some degree scripted. It's controlled to some degree. We are meant to be characters not just experiencing, but also learning and growing and learning to work with energy, as I pointed at earlier. But overarchingly, this is all part of some miraculous stage play on a cosmic level. They're involved, we're involved. And again, that's the question about, can this be understood? Can this be grokked? And I would point out that there's almost an inverse relationship between the fullness of the information and its ability to be understood, accepted, and integrated. So this becomes the question that we've been entertaining, which is it even possible that the fullness of what this is can be grokked, can be integrated? And what does that mean for disclosure? Does that mean that it might roll out for a while yet? And might that be actually a good thing? So rather than looking at this in a one-dimensional way, I would ask for a multidimensional perspective amongst a multidimensional reality.
Well said. Yeah, it makes me think of a distillation process. So all of the elements are there about our truer selves, our truer reality. They're always present in the solution, but it requires this distillation to draw out those truths, those core truths. And we've been going through that process of refinement. And I would encourage folks, myself included, to remain steadfast in our commitment to being advocates of frontier exploration because it's very easy, I think, to fall into a little bit of a rut or a trap once you think you've solved one aspect, and then you just can't really go further. You're stuck in that one iteration, and you cannot progress. And so it's important for us to maintain that soul of curiosity, of wonder, of excitement, of expectation, anticipation, because there is so much more to discover that will transcend our own limitations. And that's something we have to be at peace with. And you've helped me understand that on my own, that there are aspects of this experience that I can get closer to understanding now. But there are further aspects that are beyond my ability to understand, at least in this iteration. So the journey's not over. I just have to be willing to keep going. So I would encourage everyone to take on that spirit as well, as we move this conversation forward in the coming days and weeks ahead. There is a lot, I think, to be excited about, but we do live in a very tumultuous time. There's a lot going on in the world that I think is quite destabilizing, and it would be very easy for us to get caught up in that noise, because the noise is cacophonous. And whenever that happens, I think in the general atmosphere, which is what we've witnessed over the last several weeks, we've had such a dynamic, active noise floor here that it's kind of overwhelmed, I think, our senses, that it's made it difficult for many of us to perceive what change is actually taking place, the subtle changes that are taking place in our world. So remain tuned in, remain focused, develop your practice, encourage others along their own journeys, and together, I think we will come to a better place. So it's been great having this conversation with all of you, and look forward to the next one and where it may take us. So may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.